Good evening, everyone. Welcome. It's so wonderful to see everybody for part 2 of our brand new series on contemporary Jewish issues from Sephardic perspectives, a 4-part series with our dear friend, Rabbi Marc D. Angel. Just as a reminder, this program is for a wonderful Sephardic Digital Academy through the Sephardic Jewish Brothers of America, the national umbrella organization for Ladino-speaking Sephardic communities in the United States. And we're proud to partner for this 4-part series with the Institute for Jewish Ideas and Ideals, one of the wonderful institutes that are kind of advancing a compassionate modern orthodoxy for the 21st century. For those of you who don't know, our wonderful speaker tonight, Rabbi Marc Angel. He's the Rabbi Emeritus of Sheret Israel, the Spanish and Portuguese congregation, as well as the director of the Institute for Jewish Ideas and Ideals, and has written now over, I believe it's 36 books, right, Rabbi Angel? 36? More or less books on Jewish thought and ideas, which has been incredible. If you haven't read any of the books, I encourage you to check them out as well. Tonight, Rabbi Angel will be discussing part 2 in the series, intermarriage and conversion, some of the most, some challenging topics really in our communities. And he's going to take it from a very unique Sephardic perspective. So without further ado, Rabbi Angel, I just need you to unmute. And whenever you're ready, bechavod.
Thank you, Ethan. And good evening to everybody. Good to see you all. Well, it's a difficult topic tonight, so I hope you fasten your seatbelts. Let's just imagine that we were alive in 1800. Whether we're living in Sephardic communities or Ashkenazi communities throughout the world. In 1800, almost all Jews either were traditionally observant or were living in a community that was traditionally observant. There was just a little bit of reform growing up, little bit of heresy rising here and there, a little bit of excess freedoms among some people, but by and large, the overwhelming number of Jews were religiously observant or at least respectful to the tradition. That was 1800. Now let's skip a century later to 1900. By 1900, about, roughly speaking, 80% at least of Jews were no longer religiously observant in the same sense. They might have kept a little bit of Pesach, a little bit of Kippur, but by and large, a lot of the traditions were dropping. Jews were becoming more assimilated, more acculturated. They were gaining more rights, especially in Europe. And even in North Africa, the Middle East, where the European colonialists took over and had tremendous influence. In 1 century, the Jews changed from a very, very traditional community to a very, very untraditional community. And not only was that 100 years marked by changes in attitudes and observances, it was also a time of tremendous migration. Jews were leaving the old world, coming to the new world. Some are going to the incipient land of Israel, the land of Israel, incipient state of Israel. Jews were on the move. The world was changing. One thing that religion doesn't like too much is change. Change is threatening. It's not just that religion doesn't like change. People in general have a reluctance. Systems, establishments don't like radical change because radical change entails people's allegiances moving in different directions and we're not sure exactly how to lead, how to go. Now let's imagine again, we're back at the beginning of the 1800s. At that time, we're talking about Western Europe or Eastern Europe at this time. Jews were gaining rights. The reform movement, which kind of started in the, let's say, late 1700s, was getting traction. Jews in Germany, Europe, and France were getting more and more rights and more assertive, more participatory in society at large. With the rise of reform, the Orthodox establishment or the traditionalists had to decide what to do. How do you combat this radical change in observance? We once had a community where everyone listened to us, the rabbis. Everyone kept Shabbat, everyone kept Kashrut, everyone followed the rules. And now, increasingly, greater numbers of Jews are not following us and not following the rules. How are we supposed to maintain tradition in the light of so much change? Different approaches. One of the great rabbis at that time was known as the Khatam Sofer. The Khatam Sofer said, reform is a curse. Reform threatens to undermine all the foundations of Judaism. And he says, I'll quote him, he says, if I had a choice, if I had power over them, my opinion would be to separate them from our borders. We should not give our daughters to them. Their sons and their daughters should not be accepted for our sons. We should have our community as us. We're the Jews, the real Jews, and they are the heretics. They don't belong anymore to the healthy, proper Torah Jewish community. A strong view, but not a lone view. This view got more and more traction, so that the traditionalists, we'll call them Orthodox at that time, were building higher and higher walls between themselves and the non-observant, in their view, non-observant, the Reform, the people who are not affiliated at all, but were drifting away from tradition. Well, until 1800, let's say, there were very, very few examples of Jews marrying Christians or Muslims. Very rare. It happened, but rare. Why? They wouldn't marry us, first of all. And we wouldn't marry them. Each religious community had its own identity and lived within its own boundaries and tried to maintain their own solidarity. It was not normal, not usual, for Jews to marry non-Jews, A, by choice, and B, they had no choice. Yes, we want to marry other Jews, but the non-Jews wouldn't marry us anyway. It's not relevant. And to marry a non-Jew would mean to basically forfeit one's connection to the Jewish community. Starting in the 1800s, though, the situation changed. Jews were intermixing with non-Jews to a much higher extent. They were going to non-Jewish schools. They were having engagements in business. And all of a sudden, Jews were falling in love with non-Jews, and non-Jews were falling in love with Jews, and they wanted to get married. Uh-oh, what do we do? Well, if you go to the Khatam Sofer, you go to the traditionalist rabbis, what you do is you tell the Jewish partner you cannot marry a non-Jew, and if you do, we sit shiva, you're out of the community, you no longer exist. Okay, that's one approach. The other approach is, just a second, if Jews are marrying non-Jews, what if a non-Jew decides, okay, I'll become Jewish, I'll accept Judaism? What do we do then? Historically, Jews, halakha, has frowned on people who want to convert to Judaism for ulterior motives. They want to convert for the sake of marriage. It's frowned upon. It's not forbidden, by the way, but it's frowned upon. It's not ideal. Ideally, if people want to convert, they should convert because they love God, they love the Torah, they love the mitzvot, they want to be part of the community. The ideal situation is that way. But very often, I would say the majority of cases, it's not ideal. Excuse me a moment. Many people come to convert for ulterior motives. They want to get married to a Jewish partner. All right. The Jewish partner takes the non-Jewish fiance, male or female, and comes to the rabbi. Rabbi, my fiance here is not Jewish, but wants to convert so we could get married. What is the rabbi supposed to do? Different approaches. Khatam Sofer says, get out of my office. There's nothing to talk about. There is no such thing as a marriage between Jews and non-Jews. We're not going to convert you. We don't convert you unless you are absolutely sincere about keeping all the mitzvot. If you come with sincerity, forgetting this, that you want to marry a Jewish person, but you want to observe the mitzvot, you want to be part of the Jewish people, and you want to study Torah, and you want to put on tefillin every morning, or if you're a woman, you want to observe all the laws of the Torah, then we could talk to you. But if you're coming here to convert for the sake of marriage, we have nothing to talk about. Go away. Well, what does this couple do? They're not really interested in observing everything. Let's face it. The Jewish partner, himself or herself, is moderately observant, moderately traditional enough to want to come to a rabbi to seek conversion for the non-Jewish partner, but not traditional enough to say, I want to keep all the mitzvot from top to bottom. What does this couple do? Well, they can go to the Reform rabbi. The Reform rabbi makes it much easier for them. Okay, that's one way to solve the problem. The Orthodox establishment in Europe, since they were so nervous about reform, they said anyone who goes to reform, the conversion is zero. Means nothing, they're still goyim. The marriages and intermarriages, they're not part of our community. There were rabbis in Europe also who said, just a second, what does the halakha actually say? If you go back to the Talmud, if you go back to the Rambam, you go back to the Shulchan Aruch, what does it actually say about conversion? Yes, ideally, person should convert for ideal purposes, not for the sake of marriage, not for ulterior motives. That's correct. But what if a person does convert for ulterior motives, or a person comes with ulterior motives? May we accept such a person or not? If you look at the Talmud itself, you look at the Rambam, the Shulchan Aruch, it's an open question. In fact, the Rambam says, strikingly, that if a man will undergo circumcision and go to the mikveh, we didn't ask him anything, we didn't tell him anything, and goes to the mikveh for the sake of conversion, and there's a bet din present, and the person comes out, and then shortly thereafter, the person goes and worships idols, Rambam says the person is Jewish. The person is still Jewish. Had the wrong motives, we didn't know what the motives were. The person didn't study in yeshiva. The person didn't go through a whole long process of studying, but underwent circumcision and mikveh, and the ritual of immersion, and said this was for the sake of conversion, and there was a presence of a bet din. That person is Jewish. Doesn't mean Rambam thinks that's a great idea, but that person is Jewish. So if we look at the halakha itself, the sources, there is a very, very wide spectrum of positions, from the position I just mentioned by the Rambam to the position of Khatam Sofer. Some are very, very open. There's room to be very open, and some are very constricting. I think that the basic difference between the Khatam Sofer and the Rambam's position isn't found in the texts of the halakha, but is found in sociology, in political things, and in a person's own specific way of looking at life. Let me give an example. There were two great rabbis in the 20th century in Israel. Rabbi Abraham Isaac Kook was a great Ashkenazic rabbi, and Rabbi Uziel, Rabbi Ben Zion Uziel, who was a great Sephardic rabbi. Rabbi Uziel was a younger contemporary of Rav Kook. The two of them knew each other, they worked respectfully with each other. When it came to conversion, they had totally opposite positions. Rav Kook said, unless a person who comes to convert promises to keep all the mitzvot from beginning to end, we don't accept him. And any rabbis who convert such a person who's not going to be totally observant, that rabbi is doing a big sin. Terrible thing. The conversion, not a conversion. The rabbis have done a horrible sin. End of story. Rabbi Uziel, on the other hand, says, if you look at the halakha itself, if you go to the basic sources, not only is it not forbidden for the rabbi to accept such a convert, the rabbi has a mitzvah to accept such a convert. What? Rabbi Uziel goes that far. It's a mitzvah to accept a person to convert, even if we know in advance the person will not observe all the mitzvot. Wow, what is Rabbi Uziel basing himself on? Well, let's go back a bit. Rav Kook had a conception of what a Jew is. His basic idea was drawn from the Zohar, from Kabbalah, that basically a Jewish soul is different from a non-Jewish soul. And he has this in various of his writings. Jews are born ontologically different from non-Jews. Our souls are qualitatively different from the souls of non-Jews. We have Kedusha, we have holiness. And what is the holiness that fills our souls? The holiness is the holiness of the Torah. Every Jew, whether observant or not, has the holiness of the Torah in their soul. Now, how could a non-Jew who doesn't have this holiness in their soul, how can they become Jewish? Very, very difficult, very, very difficult. Only the rarest person who really studies Torah and absorbs the Torah and observes the Torah to the bottom letter, only such a non-Jew can hope to transform his soul into a Jewish soul. And it's very, very rare. If a person just comes and says, I want to be Jewish, like joining a Republican Party or Democratic Party, well, it's nonsense. Conversion isn't just going through a ceremony. Conversion is a transformation of the soul. And to transform a non-Jewish soul into a Jewish soul is next to impossible. And it can only be done if the non-Jew accepts every mitzvah and devotes himself or herself to fulfill the Torah 100%. That's Rav Kook. Rabbi Uziel had a different point of view. He said, you know what? Jewish souls and non-Jewish souls are identical. We don't have a machine that measures holiness in souls. This is all a Kabbalistic idea. You want to believe it, you're welcome to believe it. But the halakha itself doesn't speak in those terms. The halakha gives us specific guidelines on how to convert a person. And if you look at the Talmud says if a person comes to convert, you teach him some of the mitzvot, some of the heavy mitzvot, some of the light mitzvot. You don't tell them everything. You tell them the Jewish people, we suffer. They're anti-Semites. They give us a hard time. Are you sure you want to do this? Are you sure you want to raise your kids as Jews in a hostile world? And then if the person says, yes, I'm interested, I'd like to do it anyway, the Gemara says, we convert them. They didn't go through a course for 2 years. They weren't approved by a bet din of 10 rabbis. It's a very simple process. If you look at the Shulchan Aruch, there are 2 chapters on conversion. The Rambam is 1 chapter on conversion, 1.5 chapters on conversion. They're simple things. It has nothing to do with your soul. It has to do with a person saying, I want to be part of the Jewish people. I accept basic mitzvot. Doesn't say which mitzvot or how many mitzvot, but I give a general feeling I want to be like all the other Jews. And that's enough. Rabbi Uziel says, why do I take this position? I take this position, A, because the Talmud, the Rambam, the Shulchan Aruch allow it. There's a latitude for such a position. I take it for pragmatic reasons. The pragmatic reason is, if we turn people away, what are we doing to the Jewish people? A couple is coming. They want to get married. One is Jewish, one is not Jewish. The non-Jewish person says, I'm willing to convert and marry, I'm willing to raise a Jewish family. Rabbi Uziel says, when we turn them away, we're not just turning these people away. We're turning away their children. We're turning away a Jewish family. Our obligation, if we really are sincere and religious, our obligation is, what can we do best to maintain Jewish families? What can we do best to maintain Jewish communities? Rabbi Uziel says, one day, the heavenly court's going to come after us and say, why did you turn these people away? You turned away their children that could have been Jewish, they could have been raised within the Jewish family and a Jewish community. And because you were so hard and so harsh and you turned them away, you broke up that possible family. Now, Rabbi Uziel didn't say this is the best way for people to convert. He doesn't say that's ideal. Ideally, we'd like people to come sincerely, observe everything. But Rabbi Uziel was asked a variety of questions from a variety of rabbis. And in each case, he answered the same way. He said he dreads the idea of turning away a non-Jewish person who comes to Orthodox rabbis to convert. He says to turn them away is an injustice to this couple, and it's an injustice to the Torah, to injustice to the Jewish people. He says this is what he thinks, and this is what he learned from his rabbis. He says, I'm not liberal when it comes to conversion. I'm very strict when it comes to against intermarriage. I don't want there to be intermarriage. And therefore, we have to find ways to get the non-Jewish partner in the door so this person will observe. The question came up to other rabbis in Israel, in the diaspora, and they all brought different arguments, different reasonings. Some of the reasoning was as follows, especially for those non-Jews who were going to live in Israel. Rabbi Unterman, for example, was the Ashkenazi chief rabbi. He said, we have to be more open and tolerant and bring these people in. They're living in Israel. They came to live in Israel. We have to find a way to let them absorb themselves into the Jewish people and into the Jewish state. And right now, if you've been reading the news, which I'm sure you have, you see what a disaster it is in Israel, that there are literally hundreds of thousands of people, mainly from Russia, who have Jewish ancestry. They may have Jewish father or Jewish grandfather, who are living in Israel, who speak Hebrew, who are fighting in the Israeli army, but are considered to be non-Jews. And when they go to the rabbinate to convert, the official rabbanut, they're told you have to study for X years, you have to accept the mitzvot, you have to keep Shabbat to the last letter, you have to keep A, B, C, and D, and they're not willing to do that. And then if they convert through the army, the rabbanut says, we don't accept it. So these people are left in limbo. So we have thousands upon thousands of people living in Israel, speaking Hebrew, living basically Jewish lives, who are considered by the rabbanut, the rabbinic establishment, to be not Jews, but they're, for all practical purposes, are living Jewish lives. Rabbi Unterman and many others said we have to find ways to bring them in. Probably the most important outspoken writer and teacher today on the subject is Rabbi Chaim Amsalem, who has a Moroccan background, who is a Haredi rabbi. He has a black hat, walks around in a long black coat. He's a Haredi rabbi in principle, but in point of fact, he's a Sephardic rabbi. He says we have to follow what did our rabbis in North Africa or in the Ottoman Empire, how did they deal with conversions? And we had cases. And Rabbi Amsalem, going through all the literature, finds that in almost all cases, not all, but almost all cases, the Sephardic rabbis had the attitude, how can we be inclusive? How can we find a way to bring these people into the fold and be accepted as Jews and live as Jews? It doesn't mean they were successful in every case. It doesn't mean that everyone was happy with that position. There are people who said, no, we should build a higher fence. So for example, the Syrian community is allergic to conversion. Not just because they're allergic to conversion, but it's based on a logic. What's a logic? The rabbi said, starting early in the 20th century, actually, they made a proclamation. The community will not accept any converts to Judaism, no matter who did the conversion. Why? This tells every young man and young girl, young lady, don't even start going out with a non-Jew, because there's no way out. If you know ahead of time that you're not going to be able to convert that person, you won't start with them in the first place. That's the hope. And in fact, I think in point of fact, it can be shown that in the Syrian community, intermarriage is fairly low compared to the rest of the Jewish community. They have cases of people who marry out, and they have cases of people who marry converts, but when they do so, there's a stigma attached to it. And sometimes they have business problems. Family doesn't like them to marry out. It goes against the mores of the community. And there's a logic to it. I'm not saying it's not logical. But Rabbi Uziel's position was not that way. Rabbi Uziel's position is, and not only Rabbi Uziel, the position is that we have to deal with reality as it is. Not reality as we want it to be, but reality as it is. Reality as it is that Jews and non-Jews intermix very often. We're not going to be able to stop that unless we're living in isolated ghettos, which some Haredim do that. But for most of us who live in the open world and have freedoms, and our kids go to regular non-Jewish schools and universities, there's going to be intermarriage. There's not any way out of that. That's just going to happen. And the question now is not do we like it or not do we not like it? The question is, how do we deal with it? We could take a hard stance and say, you know what? If you going out with a non-Jewish person, we will not convert the person. You marry them, you go to a Reform rabbi, you marry them intermarried, you're out of the family, you're out for, you could say that. And maybe up until 50 years ago, that might have been effective. But today, let's face it, folks, it's not going to be very effective. Most parents are not going to cut off their kids anymore because of that. It's not going to happen. Some will, some, God bless them, but most are not. So the question is not what's ideal. The question is, what should we do? And that is a matter of perspective. So for example, Rabbi Chaim David Halevi, who was the Sephardic chief rabbi of Tel Aviv, passed away in 1998. Rabbi Halevi, in his discussion of conversion, says that the halakha specifically allows latitude, and the decision to convert or not to convert is left to the judgment of the individual rabbis. Each rabbi has to evaluate the case that comes before him, not the case, the person. Will this person be sincere? Will this person integrate into the Jewish community? Or does a person himself or herself really take it as a joke. If it's just a joke, there's a limit to how much a rabbi can be lenient. If they're just doing this as a joke and they just want a piece of paper to say, yes, I'll be Jewish, and then go ahead and live their lives the way they want, most rabbis who have any integrity won't want to convert such a person. But there are many people, and I'm experienced in this for many, many years, who come sincerely and they say, I want to live like all the other Jews live. I'm not going to be more religious. I'm not going to be less religious. I want to join the synagogue. I want to come to the synagogue. I want to keep Pesach. I want to keep Kippur. I want to say Kiddush Friday night. Will I keep everything to the last letter? I won't. At least not now. I don't know enough to do it all. But my direction is I want to become more traditional. The person isn't 100% perfect yet. That's okay. Now, again, the problem we have today among Sephardic rabbis as well as Ashkenazic rabbis is that what I call the tolerant approach, the inclusive approach, is not popular among the Orthodox rabbinate, including among many Sephardic rabbis. There's been a much greater turn towards the right, and this turn has become a wall between us, the good guys, and those non-religious, non-observant who are the bad guys. It's us against them. I had a meeting, not me, just particularly, the rabbis of Orthodox rabbis in Midtown Manhattan had a meeting some years ago about conversion issues. And we were all talking over cases that we were dealing with and what we should do, what we shouldn't do. And one of the rabbis said specifically, we have the power. We can make them do anything we want them to do. We shouldn't concede anything to them. The converts should study for 2-3 years, however long it takes, and they should keep every mitzvah and learn the Birkat Hamazon by heart and do every single thing that's possible. And if they don't like it, it's too bad for them. We have the power. So when it was my turn to talk, I said, did we become rabbis in order to exert power? Or did we become rabbis in order to help people be Jewish? What kind of power? Why is this power? Our goal isn't to make people suffer, to show we're tough, we can make demands, and you have to follow it our way or we'll throw you out. That's not a Torah way of looking at things, in my opinion. The Torah is Dorachea Darchei Noam. It's a way of sweetness. It's a way of pleasantness. We have to deal not with the world the way we want it to be. We have to deal with the world the way it is. And the halakha itself is liberal. The halakha itself, if you're going back to the Talmud and to the Rambam Shulchan Aruch, they're greatly more liberal than the Rabbanut and the rabbinical establishment today. Now, here's another thing. Once a person does convert, with proper halakhic authority, with proper Orthodox rabbis, the question always comes up, is this going to be accepted? Will the rabbis in Israel accept it? The rabbis have a blacklist. They only take conversions only by certain rabbis they accept, certain other rabbis they don't accept. They don't accept even Orthodox rabbis in Israel. They don't accept all of them. And who do they accept? Only the ones who will follow their particular stringencies. To me, this represents a betrayal of halakha, betrayal of Torah. It's not up to them to decide if a person is Jewish or not Jewish. It's up to the Almighty to decide. And if the rabbis who did the conversion are duly qualified and learned Orthodox rabbis who in their own judgment feel this person is a valid convert, it doesn't matter if the Rabbanut says yes or the Rabbanut says no. It has nothing to do with the Rabbanut. It's a decision between the rabbi, the convert, and the Almighty. The problem is, even though I'm correct in saying that, in real life, the converts may have to suffer. If they want to go on Aliyah, for example, they have to go through all kinds, jump through hoops to get their conversion accepted and to be accepted as Jews. The situation today is made more difficult because I think the classic Sephardic approach, represented by Rabbi Uziel and many others, Rabbi Amsalem points out many rabbis in North Africa, and there's certainly very many rabbis of the Ladino-speaking background as well, who were understanding of the human dimension. Conversion isn't just a matter of what does the book say or does the book doesn't say. It's not a matter of appearances. It's not a matter of looking more religious or less religious than anybody else. It's a matter of being just, honest, loving, and inclusive. Sometimes we'll convert a person and the person will turn out to be, quotation marks, a very bad convert. I wish I didn't do that one. It happens. And sometimes we'll convert a person and they'll become much better than born Jews in many, many ways. Very often, in my own personal experience, the people who've converted have been extraordinary people. They've been people who've been willing to make radical change in their own lives, in their own identities, which isn't easy. And even if they will not accept all the mitzvot, they've accepted a lot. They've accepted to live as Jews, identify as Jews, to raise children as Jews. This is itself quite a commitment in this day and age. I think we have to go back to the fundamental teaching of the Torah, and as espoused by Rabbi Halevi, En l'dayan ela ma she'einav ra'ot. A judge can only judge a case based on what his eyes see. And every rabbi has to be responsible. The problem we have had in the past is sometimes rabbis, whether they're modern Orthodox or Haredi Orthodox, they make a business out of conversion. This is a sad thing. And it's a true thing, I hate to say it. But they do conversion and they get paid for it. And so people will come and they'll give them thousands of dollars and they'll give them a piece of paper that they're Jewish. And because of this scandalous situation, it gives a bad name to the whole process of conversion and to Orthodox rabbinate in general. But there are many other rabbis, and myself include that in that list, who don't occur to all that many people. They convert a few people, and only those that they know that are part of their own community and part of their own families, part of their own circle of friends and family, and who don't take money for it. I never took a penny for conversion. It's not for sale. And when I meet a person who wants to convert, I tell them you don't have to convince me. It's not between you and me. It's between you and the Almighty. And unless you're willing to stand before the Almighty and say, I accept upon myself responsibilities of being Jewish, don't come back to me. It's your responsibility, not mine. If you go out after I teach you and after you learn and after you are converted and you go out and eat a ham sandwich, it's not my responsibility. I'm going to sleep at night. It's your responsibility. So don't take this on unless you're serious about it. So let me go back to the beginning. In Europe, the rabbis built high walls. Why did they build high walls? Because they were afraid of reform. There was a very strong opposition. And the only way the Orthodox rabbis in Europe could prove that they are the authorities is by denigrating and disqualifying anybody who wasn't them. And if anyone who didn't follow all the mitzvot was out. And Rav Kook had this Kabbalistic idea that only people whose souls were Jewish could be Jewish. And it's very rare for a non-Jewish person to cross the bridge and get a Jewish soul unless they fill themselves with Torah. Most of the rabbis living in Muslim countries, they weren't fighting against reform. Most of the Sephardic world had no reform to deal with. Didn't mean everyone was observant. Didn't mean people that we didn't have our share of people who argued with us and people who agreed and didn't agree. We had all of that, but we didn't have a formal reform movement to fight against. The rabbis in the Muslim world had greater leeway. They could go back to the sources in the Talmud and the sources in the Rambam, the sources of the Shulchan Aruch, and they could judge based on what their eyes saw. They could judge based on what they think is best for this couple, based on what they think is better for this family, and based on what's best for this community and what's best for the children that may yet come. They didn't worry, what will the reforms say? How will I be compromising my integrity? They didn't have to fight that fight. And because they didn't have to fight that fight, they felt a greater freedom and greater latitude in order to come up with solutions that they thought were better. Now, you can tell from what I've said, my own views on the subject. My own view is very inclusive. It doesn't mean we want to include people who are trying to fake. We don't want to include people who are clearly insincere. But if you sit down with people and get to know them and invest in their lives, you realize that there's very quality, wonderful people who are not Jewish, who will make very fine Jews. They'll make very good Jews, even if they're not going to accept every single mitzvah. We want them to accept every mitzvah. We teach them everything we could teach them. But when all is said and done, our goal is to have them reach a certain level of acceptance, a certain level of observance, a certain level of commitment to the Jewish people, and a recognition that being Jewish is not always easy. We do face anti-Semitism. We're going to bring children into the world in a world where there's still hostility against Jews. And you have to be sure to make that commitment out of a sincere and clear thinking. And once a person has gone through that process and has evolved and feels ready to become part of the Jewish people, it's up to us as a community to accept them. Now, I know so many cases of people who have gone through Orthodox rabbis and have gone through hell, literally. They've been rejected, they've been turned away, they've been given tests, even when they pass the test, they were told to come back a second time. They come back the second time and the rabbi isn't there for the meeting. There's nightmares of cases in Israel in particular, but in the United States and the diaspora also. Orthodox rabbis are afraid to get involved. They're afraid to get involved because the Rabbanut in Israel is calling all the shots. The Rabbinical Council of America in the United States has basically succumbed to the demands of the Rabbanut in Israel. So the latitude that was once given to rabbis to make decisions is more or less taken away, and rabbis are afraid to make judgments. How is that going to change? It's not going to change by a commandment from up above. It's only going to change if the communities themselves will open their mouths and stand behind their rabbis and demand that the rabbis be more inclusive. It's not up to just the Rabbanut in Israel to make decisions for us. We have a community, we have synagogues, we have congregations, we have families. We need our rabbis to be responsive to the needs. It doesn't mean to sell out any of our principles. It doesn't mean to compromise our values. It means to draw on the full toolkit, the full toolbox that is available to us within the halakhic literature. And the halakhic literature is vast and leaves us a lot of room. The problem today is everyone's afraid of to look over their right shoulder or afraid of to look over the left shoulder. In 2007, I founded the Institute for Jewish Ideas and Ideals. That's co-sponsoring this series, by the way, with the Sephardic Brotherhood. I ask all of you, if you're not already members of ours, to go to jewishideas.org. See what we're doing. We're trying to fight the good fight for a Judaism which is very traditional, but which is intellectually vibrant, compassionate, and inclusive. We have thousands of members worldwide, thousands, and we have thousands of readers, but it's not enough. We need to be able to create a counter movement, a movement of people who think and who demand and who are not shy to speak up on behalf of Torah true point of view. Some people say, well, you're not as religious. Who's defining religious? Religious isn't if you wear a black hat and a long enough coat. That doesn't make you religious. Religious is your framework between you and God. That's what religious is. Religious is, are you serving the Torah with sincerity, with honesty, and truthfully to the sources themselves, and not being influenced by outside sources and influences. We need independence. We need thinking. And that's not going to happen until and unless the community at large expects it and demands it. Until that happens, we're going to just keep on sliding, and communities are still going to keep on losing. I've seen so many families suffer needlessly. So many would-be converts suffer needlessly. And people who have already converted, who have trouble integrating into their synagogues because they're looked at as being a little different. You know what? All of us are converts. All of us came to Mount Sinai as slaves in the wilderness, slaves in Egypt. And all of us came to Judaism out of free choice, whether we know it or not, going back then. We all had to make commitments. And today we all have to make commitments. We're all Jews by choice. No one can force us to be Jewish anymore. We have to be able to make that decision ourselves. I think the Sephardic tradition, certainly from North Africa and the Ottoman Empire, give us enough foundation and confidence to deal with this question in an intelligent, compassionate, and inclusive way, a way that's healthy for our families and a way that makes our Jewish people thrive and grow, and that we can look at our children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren yet to come with pride and with happiness. That's what I have to say tonight. I know there'll be some questions, so I turn it back to Ethan, and if anyone does have questions, I'm happy to try to respond.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Angel. Zaka Baruch, as always, on this really beautiful and really, frankly, very important subject for the modern era. Certainly, it's something that all our communities struggle with. We have quite a number of questions. If you do have a question, please enter into the chat, and we're going to try to get to as many as we can with the time we still have. First question we have right here. How would you propose Orthodox and Sephardic rabbis deal with the form of conservative conversions? How should we deal with the treatment of Jews who are Jewish on the basis of their father versus their mother? And where do we draw the line ultimately?
All very good questions. I'm going to answer as an Orthodox rabbi, all right? As an Orthodox rabbi, conversions must be performed according to halacha, period. Halacha is broad. There's a lot of room in halacha, but there's still limits. So a conversion done by non-Orthodox rabbis, I don't rule them all out necessarily automatically, but 99.9% of them are not following the halakhic strictures, either by the way they teach the students, or even more fundamentally, the rabbis themselves are not ritually observant themselves. In other words, to be on a bet din, you have to be a shomer Shabbat. You have to be observant, Torah observant Jew. And many non-Orthodox rabbis aren't shomer Shabbat in our sense of the term. So it's difficult. There have been cases, for example, of very traditional conservative rabbis, certainly going back 30, 40 years, where the conservative rabbis, a lot of them grew up Orthodox, where I've seen cases where great rabbis, greater than me, have accepted those conversions. But it's a gray area. In case of patrilineal descent, it's also problematic. Now, there's the classic halacha doesn't consider a person Jewish if the mother isn't Jewish. The father is Jewish, the person has a Jewish name, the person was raised Jewish. So there's a concept that Rabbi Uziel quotes, and Rabbi Amsalem makes a big deal out of, called Zera Yisrael. It means the person has Jewish seed, the person's Jewish stock. The person can't be considered an outright not Jew. The person has Jewish blood in them, so to speak, right? The father is Jewish, the grandfather was Jewish. There's something innately Jewish about this person. And now the person wants to convert or wants to be considered Jewish. So what we recommend in those cases is that people do convert, but we make it as easy as possible. Years and years ago, when the chief rabbi of Israel, Rabbi Mordechai Eliyahu, we had cases, which I brought to him, of people who are like crypto Jews and now they're coming back to Judaism. For all these generations, they lived as Christians, and now they're discovering their Jewish ancestry, and they want to come back to Judaism. The problem is, they're so far removed from Jewish observance and Jewish knowledge, but they consider themselves Jews now. What are we supposed to do with such people? So some people say, well, if they consider themselves to be Jewish, they're Jewish. From an Orthodox perspective, it's hard to say that. We don't know. If they could prove it infallibly, yes, and some people can. But in most cases, it's better to go through a conversion. Don't have to make them study for 2 years and 5 years and give them all the hard things to do, but you make it as easy as possible, but they still have to go through some process of conversion. And on the conversion certificate, instead of saying that this is a conversion certificate, we say it's a conversion for one who's returning to the traditions of his ancestors. So the person realizes it's a return rather than a conversion. And therefore, I think people who have Zera Yisrael, people who have Jewish stock, we should be we should push as far as we can to inclusivity to bring them in the fold, but without compromising halacha. They still need, if it's a man, they still need circumcision, they still need to go to the mikvah, they should still learn some basic things about Judaism and Jewish life, and we should have a sense that they belong to a community. In my own personal experience as a rabbi over 50 years, I tried, in almost every case I succeeded, I tried never to get involved in conversions except in cases where people were somehow part of my own community. When people call me now to say, I want to convert, I say, find an Orthodox rabbi near where you live. The problem is 25 years ago when I said that, there were Orthodox rabbis where they lived. Now, fewer and fewer Orthodox rabbis want to get involved because they're scared. But we still have to, we can't discard the halakha, and I think it would be a mistake to discard halakha. But we should recognize halakha has lots of room. And we have to find ways of opening up the rabbis to the roominess of halakha for the betterment, not only of the individuals who want to convert, but for the betterment of their families and the betterment of our communities at large.
Next question here. Wouldn't much of the problem with Israel and the Rabbanut be solved if there was a separation of church and state, or in this case, church and synagogue, synagogue and state, excuse me?
Frankly, I'm in favor of that. I know it's a very, very delicate subject. I think people aren't, the Haredim, the Rabbanut, they're entitled to say, I don't want my son to marry that convert, that girl who's a convert by such and such rabbis, or I don't want my daughter to marry that convert. They're entitled. If they want to do that, that's their business. What they're not entitled to do is to tell everybody else you can't do it. Everyone makes their own judgments. Everyone's entitled to their own standards. But since the halakha is so inclusive and there's so much room, you have to say that people who follow the more inclusive attitude, their conversions are also fine conversions. And those who want to marry those people could get married according to halakha. As long as the Rabbanut in Israel is authorized by the government, there's going to be trouble. It's not, in the old days when you had rabbis like Rabbi Uziel or Rabbi Unterman, some other rabbi, you had great rabbis who are above politics. You could have hope that the Rabbanut could be effective. But in our day and age, the Rabbanut became just another bunch of, I hate to say it, rabbinic hacks, political hacks looking for power. And that's our problem. As long as they've defiled the position. Here's what one would think. Israel is in business since 1948. They have this chief rabbinate. What we would think is that by now all the people in Israel should love religion. They should be so respectful of the Rabbanut. They should be, this is just what a wonderful thing to have chief rabbis who are so moral and ethical and who raise our standards and give us great spiritual highs. What a wonderful thing. Wouldn't it be nice if they said that? The vast majority of Israelis in all the polls hate the rabbinate. They aren't inspired. The Haredim aren't popular among the vast majority of Israelis. If they want to live that way, they're entitled to live that way. No one's saying no. But they're not entitled to impose it on everyone else. And that is our problem today. As long as they have political power, they can impose it on everybody else. And that has to be taken away. Let everyone decide for themselves what to accept and what not to accept.
What are your thoughts on some arrangements today, like, for example, in the Beth Din of America and other major rabbinic institutions that have kind of negotiated these agreements with the rabbinate in Israel to elongate certain processes, but to gain more legitimacy from the state?
This problem started, sadly enough, in 1907, 2007, with the chief rabbi happened to be Sephardic Rabbi Amar. The problem came, by the way, from the Sephardic rabbis, more from the Ashkenazic rabbis at that time. For those who don't know, I was president of the Rabbinical Council of America from 1990 to 1992. So I was a big shot in those days. In 2007, people still listened to me a little bit. So I called up all the big shots in the RCA and said, don't let the rabbinate in Israel cow us down. We have to stand up for our rights. Stand up, don't sell us out. Right? Well, you know, that's a Rabbanut. We can't really fight with them. And all my lobbying and all my discussion, we had just a handful of rabbis who were with me fighting the decision, and we lost, plain and simple. The American rabbinate, Orthodox rabbinate, surrendered, plain and simple. They don't say it that way, they deny it, but in point of fact, that's what happened. And in point of fact, what happened is that creating the system of Batei Din takes away any power from the local rabbi to make decisions. Every rabbi is afraid to decide. I have to send them to the Bet Din. The Bet Din is afraid to make a lenient position because another Bet Din don't look down on them, or the rabbinate in Israel will reject their conversion. So everyone is so afraid, so afraid, so afraid. So no, the number of conversions go way down, and the process becomes uglier, and people have very bad stories about what they had to go through in order to convert. This isn't Judaism. This is a corruption of Judaism. This isn't the way it's supposed to be. This way isn't the way what used to be. When I was a young rabbi, going way back when, and as a member of the Rabbinical Council of America, the rabbis were given credibility. If Orthodox rabbis from the Rabbinical Council of America did a conversion, the Rabbanut in Israel accepted it. The Rabbanut in Israel used to have a directory of the names of the rabbis of the Rabbinical Council of America. And if they got a conversion certificate, they would look, who is it? Oh yes, these rabbis from the RCA, it's fine. Or they would call up the RCA office. Are these still members of your organization? Are these people reliable? The rabbinate, the RCA would say, yes, these are members, are perfectly good Orthodox rabbis. Done. Story's over. That's how it used to be. But the rabbinate in Israel didn't like that anymore. They want to be in charge. They want to say, you're acceptable, you're not acceptable. We decide, you don't decide. So the individual rabbi has lost power, lost credibility. And whenever you put authority, you concentrate authority in fewer hands, you have greater and greater trouble. Greater and greater trouble.
Just another question here from the chat. Sorry, 1 second here. Sorry. Okay. How do we empower local Sephardic rabbis to kind of push back on this Haredization or this kind of Israelization of the conversion system? How do we empower them and lift them up?
Next question. I wish I had a good answer to that. The problem that we have isn't Sephardic or Ashkenazic anymore. The problem we have is the halachic establishment. Sephardic rabbis, just like Ashkenazic rabbis, they want to be accepted. They don't want to be pushed aside. So how do they get accepted? They get accepted by putting on black hats and looking like they're Haredim and looking like they're black hat rabbis. And it's through no fault of theirs. I'm not faulting anybody, but it's a natural instinct. You're an Orthodox rabbi. You want to have credibility as an Orthodox rabbi. You follow the establishment. So if you remember the Rabbinical Council of America, you send your converts to the Bet Din of the RCA, and that's what you do. You don't take personal responsibility. It's too hard to create your own Bet Din. If you create your own Bet Din, they won't accept it. Then where are you? You're nowhere. Where are your converts? You're also nowhere. So the whole establishment is faulty. It takes tremendous amount of guts to resist the establishment. The establishment is way, way too powerful. So some of us do, but it's too much to expect that all of them will. And in fact, many of the Sephardic rabbis in Israel have become the most Haredized rabbis there are. They've become the most stringent, most troublesome rabbis in Israel. And the rabbis here, I don't know all the rabbis in America, all the Sephardic rabbis anymore. I used to. So I'm not involved in the synagogue rabbinate anymore. I've been emeritus since 2007, and I devote myself to my institute. So I know that there's some very fine young rabbis, but I know that young rabbis, whether they're Sephardic or Ashkenazic, are still afraid of the establishment. And I don't fault them for being afraid. They're being cautious. They need to be accepted. And I think it's, unless the synagogues themselves give them a feeling of independence, they're never going to have the independence.
A historical question, you might not have the answer to this one. Did the Ladino-speaking Sephardic community comment on the Syrian community's edict when it was issued back in the teens and 20s?
I don't think there was any specific comment. The Syrians are entitled to make rulings for their own community. The question came to Rabbi Uziel about a community in South America, I think Argentina, where the Syrian community there had this rule. And Rabbi Uziel said you should modify the rule. Instead of just saying they never accept converts, say we don't accept converts unless they've been accepted by the Rabbanut in Israel. Just have some kind of opening, because there are really sincere, fine people who are converts. Why rule them all out? But I think most of the Ladino-speaking rabbis just stayed out of it.
So another question here about specifically the B'nai Anusim. There's a lot of challenges today about people who are from converso heritage, who are forced converts that are becoming more interested in the Judaism. What do we do about these people? How do we address this?
The first thing is we should be so grateful and glad that history has played this trick on the Catholic Church, that after all these centuries, these people still want to come back to Judaism. After all these centuries of having been hidden Jews, not even knowing that they're Jewish, it's a wonderful thing that these people are reclaiming Judaism and they want to become Jewish. Having said that, most of them know very little about Judaism, even if they want to become Jewish. In 1995, I think it was, I went to New Mexico and I met with literally hundreds of crypto Jews, people coming back to Judaism. Some very, very sincere. Some just were interested as a curiosity, but not because they really want to convert to be Jews. They just were interested. They had Jewish ancestry. I had a meeting with one young kid. He was a college student. He came to meet me. He drove up to I had like a little hotel there. He drove up and he comes in, he's wearing seat flying out. He's had a kippah. and he wants to be accepted as a Jew. He wants to go on Aliyah. But I had good glasses on in those days, and I see his bumper sticker, and the bumper sticker says, "Jesus loves me." So I said, "Your bumper sticker says Jesus loves me." He says, "He does." "Oh, okay. But you say you want to be Jewish." "Yeah, of course I want to be Jewish. On Sunday I go to church, and on Saturday I go to synagogue." Okay. It's a hybrid. He's trying to figure it out what's what. But from our point of view, he's sincere, he's beautiful, he's wonderful, but he's not right there and eligible in my book to be a full-fledged member of the Jewish community, the Jewish people. It's just tricky. So should we be open and receptive? We should. But every individual case is different, and every individual person is different. I know a number of them, and they stay in touch with me, by the way. Many of them have stayed in touch with me over the years and have written to me and stayed in some very, very nice, nicely involved in Jewish life. Rabbi Amsalem has a special program in South America for B'nai Anusim. He has teachers going down in Brazil primarily to teach these people Judaism, to establish communities, and hopefully to get them converted, or in the sense of, we call it again, the certificate of return. They don't like to call it conversion. Conversion means you weren't Jewish, now you're becoming Jewish. What we're saying is, you're Jewish, you have Jewish ancestry, you're returning to the heritage of your ancestors. It makes it softer for them, and it's also truer.
One or two last questions here, because we're almost time to wrap up. Some people are curious, could you recommend any sources, Sephardic sources for issues on conversion, like from Rabbi Uziel or Rambam or Shulchan Aruch, that specifically talks about these issues of conversion?
If you go to jewishideas.org and you type in search conversion, you'll find my article on conversion, and I cite a lot of sources. So read the whole article, of course, it's a good article, but you'll see sources that you'll need to look up also. And I have a book that I wrote about Rabbi Uziel. It's out of print now, but they have a whole chapter on Rabbi Uziel's position on conversion. But if you look on the website, we do have articles specifically about Rabbi Uziel and other rabbis on the subject of conversion.
And lastly, how do you deal with local communities when someone will move and there'll still be this resentment, or at least this kind of suspicion that the conversion wasn't fully valid, or this conversion was less than genuine?
I lose sleep over that. I lose sleep over that. My famous joke is, I'm an angel, I'm not God. And I think it's a joke, but it's my true philosophy of life. Our job isn't to judge other people. That's God's job. God has a big job. I feel sorry for him. He's got a big job. It's not my job to judge other people. My job is to accept people, to help them advance themselves as best as they can within Jewish tradition, and not to stand in judgment. I think it's morally repugnant for us to question, was this conversion valid? Are you Jewish? Are you not Jewish? Let the rabbis decide that in the back room quietly, not a public issue. And if there's a problem, clean up the problem. And if there's no problem, accept it. But people should not feel a sense of embarrassment, or am I going to be accepted, not accepted? It's too painful for them and painful for their children, and it's not necessary. And we should not judge other people. Let God be the judge. If people have questions, by the way, that we're not able to answer, feel free to send it to me at info@jewishideas.org. info@jewishideas.org. And I generally try to answer all questions that are emailed to me.
Excellent. I've also just put that into the chat if anyone else is interested in email Rabbi Angel. With that, we're at our mark for this evening, but I want to thank Rabbi Angel for this really thoughtful and stimulating discussion. I think a lot of people really enjoyed it and valued it. So Rabbi Angel, thank you so much as always for this wonderful part 2 talk. We'll be back again next week. Hope you all join us again for part 3, which is talking about, I believe it's mysticism and rationalism. Is that correct, Rabbi?
That's the 4th one. Next week
is, excuse me, I'm sorry.
Next one is about
I'm getting
universalism versus ethnicity.
Thank you. Sorry, I'm getting my class is out of whack here, but inshallah, we're going to enjoy both of them. So next week, please join us again, same time, 7:30 p.m. Eastern, 4:30 p.m. Pacific. Thank you all so much.
Thank you. you.